Welcome to the John Brown University Chapel podcast, recorded in the historic Cathedral of the Ozarks in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. This week's chapel speaker was Dr. Keith Jagger, University Chaplain at John Brown University. Prior to coming to JBU, Keith served in pastoral ministry in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Keith earned his doctoral degree in New Testament at St. Andrews in Scotland.
Good morning, guys. How are you? I see one person yawning big. All right. Anyone else feel like they've been through the ringer? It's only February. You're not alone, and to some degree. We all need, I think, an infusion of some kind of encouragement right now and energy. We need to feel a little more gentleness, I think, across the board. And kind of giving way to less of the false pressures of the world, at least. That's how I need God to speak into my area of life just now. In the midst of all of this, we have another change and experience another change today. This being the first time since I've been with you at John Brown on campus where we're not requiring masks in this space. We're in a really different moment than we were 2 years ago and even this fall. And the cabinet believes that given the trajectory of the Omicron variant numbers, we're ready to start walking beyond these past few years. For some of you, this is great news, evidenced by the clapping. For others, you have legitimate reasons to be terrified. Whatever the case, I'd love for you all to know that if you need to talk through the lifting of masks in chapel, please let me know. I've had a few conversations already with folks, which have been good. We're considering the option of making the balcony a masked space for a while, or if maybe working on one-on-one with those who are uncomfortable or feel disoriented is a better option. So please make yourself known if you're concerned. And for those still needing to wear masks in this space, I want to encourage you to keep up your resolve of conscience. And please let us know if your story might be helpful for us to navigate this moment. No doubt we need more than ever God's grace to fall upon us and a willingness to talk to one another and show one another the kind of admiration I think we all want and deserve. And we all need to thrive as humans. At my church in Canada, we had this dear nonagenarian, which means she's a person in her 90s, named Eleanor. Eleanor had advanced dementia, but she was the sweetest, wrinkliest old woman you can imagine. Every Sunday morning before the service, she'd come up to me before I'd preach. She'd come and find me, and she'd say, "Has anyone told you yet they love you today?" And usually the answer was no. And she'd grab my face and kiss my cheek without any shame, and she'd look in my eyes firmly and say, "Well, I love you." So good. And sometimes she'd do that 3 times in one morning. And every time, "Has anyone told you they love you yet today?" And I'd lie a bit the second time and say no. "Thanks, Tracy." And she'd do it again. And it was just as meaningful every time. I wish you all had an Eleanor here in this space. But since you don't, I'll have to fill in for her today. Has anyone told you yet they love you today? Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, I love you. You guys are doing great. The world needs you. God is with us. Oops. Right, friends. So there was a 3-point sermon today that got too large, and now it's a 2-pointer. So buckle up. We're going to make some headway today as we continue to deepen our understanding of the human condition and re-examine worship as a key practice to work towards our deep personal freedom. So if you have your Bibles, you can open them to Exodus 32. The Lord said to Moses, "You yourself are to speak to the Israelites. You shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout generations, given in order that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." You may be familiar with the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath being the bridge commandment between the first few, which are about honoring God, and the final few, which are about honoring others. The Sabbath is a bridge because it's about honoring God, and the human community we live in. God gives Israel the 10 Commandments just 4 weeks prior to this moment where God is talking to Moses. He gives Israel the 10 Commandments and speaks them aloud to the whole congregation as they hear him. If you remember, we're at the story of the Exodus generation where Israel's at Mount Sinai. They've been freed. It's just been a matter of a few days since they've been in Egypt, freed by 10 plagues, which got their attention. God parted the sea. God drowned the mighty army of Pharaoh, and then they survived their first desert experience where God provided food for the whole camp and gave them protection from a warring army. Then, still fresh out of Egypt, they land at the same mountain where Moses encountered God at the burning bush. And after 3 days of special preparation after their arrival, God caused a massive thundercloud of thundering lightning to hover over Mount Sinai, and he speaks audibly to the whole people through the cloud, giving them the commandments. They've come to God's house now, and God is outlining how to live in his way. Make no other gods before me. Don't take my name in vain. Keep the Sabbath, and so forth. And the people, clearly freaked out by this experience, were like, oh no, we don't want this. Like, Moses, you do that. You talk to God and tell us what he tells you. And so Moses gets called up on the mountain, and where God reveals basically Israel's societal laws to them. How to use money, how to keep the land, how to govern cities, how to use and steward property, how to deal with disputed ownership of property, which foods to eat, how to care for animals, how to rule the law court for judges, how witnesses are to be in the law court, what to do about perjury and slander, how to steward our sexuality, how to care for refugees, what to do about leprosy and witchcraft and violence and gender roles and marriage. These laws framed up Israel as a bastion of compassion and stark goodness. God's vision for his people would be marked by a profound respect of life and reverence for others. But then Moses learns that even if it appears so on the surface, these laws aren't really and only rules that you must keep. As if you break the law, you're going to upset the owner of the house. It's so much different than that. These are not simply about do's and don'ts, but they are built to free Israel, to make them wise, to make them good and compassionate, and also to free them from the effects of slavery in Egypt. The law was not simply asking something from them, but the laws were designed for them, for wisdom and freedom at the deepest levels of their being. And after revealing these societal laws, Moses then gets called up with 70 leaders of the people, and they come upon the mountain and see God sitting upon God's throne. It's amazing. You would expect this kind of vision in the book of Revelation at the very end of the Bible, but here at the very beginning, all of the leaders of Israel come upon the mountain, and they see God on his throne with a sea of sapphire beneath him, whatever that looks like. And then the elders return to the people, and then Moses goes further up and further into the cloud, where for 40 days, for a little over 4 weeks, God teaches Moses how to lead Israel in worship, about sacrifices and priests and worship and festivals and offerings, receiving the forgiveness of sins, how to follow the community of Levites, the priests who are there to help the people remember God and honor God. And this plan for worship wasn't just about God getting attention, but the whole system would be about freeing them from their slave mentality. What it is to be drawn into health and wholeness. So remember, Israel had suffered 400 years under the yoke of Pharaoh. And while we don't know the details of their life, Exodus 6 tells us much about what we need to know about them. Remember, I told you this last time. Moses and the people of Israel start having these leadership issues before they leave Egypt. But they would not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and cruel slavery. They were a people whose spirits were broken, who went through this corporate dehumanization, and this effect of slavery was still upon them. The slavery wasn't just oppressive, but it was cruel. And that sting of cruelty was heavy upon them as they waited week after week for Moses. They were a stiff-necked people, says God. And it was their own sins that had woven through them. But it was Pharaoh who crushed them. It's right there in Exodus. as we deepen our theology of sin and our understanding of the human condition and what we contend with as human beings, we have to deepen our view of sin past this idea that if I disobey a few things, that God gets beside himself, so angry he can't control himself. Sin is so much more in the Bible. Sin is about, yes, the things we end up doing which cause harm to ourselves and to others, and injury to this creation of God's. But sin is also about the ways we contend with the effects of sin-like slavery on our woven deep within our souls. We all have stories which we have walked through. We all have ways which we have been crushed. And if we're going to be free from all of that, truly free, we can't just see sin as do's and don'ts. And so they're all waiting vulnerable below the mountain as God was outlining this way of freedom for the Israel. And he writes 2 tablets of stone with his own finger of how to do this, how to live in a whole, healthy, free way. And this is just the last thing God is going to say as we get back to our verse for today. The last thing God is going to say to Moses before he sends them down to Israel on the mountain. The Lord said to Moses, "You yourself are to speak to the Israelites. You shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, given in order that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from among the people. For 6 days work shall be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Therefore the Israelites shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath through all generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." When God finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone written by the finger of God. But when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother, and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us." Just on the horizon of their hope, as God draws close to them and draws up plans for a special relationship, laws which are meant to elevate them and to free them, they throw it all away in a one-night stand by making other gods. They come into the house of the Almighty and craft out of gold a bull to worship. "Thanks for that nice rescue, Yahweh. Glad we got to hear your voice booming through the clouds a month ago. Glad our leaders got to witness you on your throne with the glassy sea beneath you. It's been 5 weeks since that Moses guy has been with us. He seems to have abandoned us. Apparently it's up to us now. We've got to find another God to save us. That false God who is gone apparently now is nothing compared to the false gods that we can make out of worship." And the scene devolves into this kind of revelry, which there's not many synonyms to this word because I don't think we like to talk about it. Revelry, if we talk about what revelry is, it is this kind of orgiastic kind of worship dancing, a kind of drunken mix of dancing and violence. And we're scratching our heads going, how in the world could they switch and turn on a pivot like this? How in the world could they be freed so dramatically and yet become so debaucherous? That's the word in the thesaurus. Like none of us know what that means. These were people who truly need to be sanctified. That word sanctified probably would do good just to talk about what that word means. Sanctify. We probably have lots of images of what this means. Here's how I get at that word the best. And I told this to my class a couple of days ago, so I apologize you have to hear this twice. So I had 2 grandpas, like we all do, and some of us have more grandpas in our life set up. I had 2 grandpas, and each of them were different kinds of men. One was a responsible engineer who had a family, and he was really kind and a bit quiet. And the other one was, you might say, a carouser. There's another thesaurus word, carouser. He was wild. He and his wife divorced when my mom was 2, leaving my mom to be raised by his mother. And he went off to, I guess, do a lot of drinking and gambling. And he worked for a time at the casinos in New Jersey and worked at the U.S. Mint. And now we have a bunch of really cool coins. And as I grew up, I met him every summer when I would travel back to New Jersey, where my mom was from. And you could kind of see these two different kind of men living their way in the world. And it's like their frailties, their vulnerabilities of who they were have come straight down into one person. It's like, how do you contend with both of those guys and one grandson? You know, and so as I started going through high school and college and coming to my own and figuring out who I was, I remembered watching my grandfather on the one side who lived close to us. I remember watching him. I told a story in the fall of my grandmother, his wife, who passed away in her early 60s of a brain tumor, which left my grandfather to live on for another 10, 11 years alone. And I watched that experience as a college student crush him. I watched him kind of fade from becoming fully human into some kind of kind, gentle, but lifeless person. And I can't imagine what it must have been like to struggle the way he did. But he lost hope, I think, at the end of it all. The hope in his life faded. And here on the other side, I barely knew my other grandfather, but when I went to visit his house after he passed away as a 12-year-old, and then searching through his house to collect things that you do before you give it all away to a thrift store, I saw things that a 12-year-old should never have seen. And there was so many half-drank bottles of hard liquor in his cabinet. And as I started contending with that as a young adult, I began seeing, oh my gosh, like I have this addictive personality inside of me, and I also have this ability to get hopeless really quickly. Both of those things have been true and still are true for me. You know, I got an Oculus for Christmas, and I'm like, you know, the rings around my eyes, the red rings are unbelievable. Like I gotta watch myself, otherwise I'll stay up all night playing table tennis. And I have been a person who's struggled with keeping up hope. And I see those two things coming down, woven deeply into me. And by the grace of God, after 10 years of contending with those things and seeking God and worshiping Him and finding my way through life situations with those two true things, those two things don't control me. I'm not a hopeless person. I know how to regather up my hope in hard times. I know how not to give over to addictive kinds of activities. I'm a person in control of my life. I've been sanctified. I'm in the process of being sanctified. That's what sanctified means. It doesn't mean like being a goody two-shoes or going around obeying all the rules. It means coming to the deep kind of healing inside of us that we need. You know, this is a strange moment for us in Israel's story. God speaking from the mountains, tablets of stones, God being on a throne of, we have no kind of cultural connection for what this means. But this is a moment that Israel comes into God's house with deeply broken spirits, victims of cruel slavery, as they discover God was not simply wanting to free them from their physical bondage, but to work deeper and deeper in them, to free them from their spiritual bondages as well. This is the moment where they begin to discover that God is not a monster, God is a rescuer, where they lift their hearts to God. When they lift their hearts to God and God's plan for worship, they find themselves healed and freed. And they actually find that. And this is the moment where they discover that revelry will not free them, but only enslave them further. I kind of want to get us into some of these unfamiliar ideas with a word picture here. Okay, imagine two kings, if you will. A wise king and a cruel, malevolent king. The cruel king had been for generations stealing the people of the wise king and enslaving them. The evil king guarded his slaves with cold calculation in his enemy's home base, which was fortified with high walls and protected by a massive army. And if this weren't enough, word had reached the wise king that in order to keep the slaves in bondage, the wicked king had infected his slaves with a disease that progressively turned them into zombies. Yes, this is a zombie story. So that they would slowly turn into animal-like flesh eaters. The evil king did not have an antidote for this, but had a potion which could hold the virus at bay just long enough to keep his slaves from eating each other. The wise and good king, heartbroken by the news, planned and listened and waited for just the right time based on the reporting of his spies. When the moment arrived, he led his forces out of his own territory to attack the fortified city, aiming at what would be the weakest and least guarded part of the guarded walls. And on that fateful night, and in the darkest hour, the wise king sprung his attack. The cries of the evil stronghold arose, but the wise king had come under the cover of night and blew a hole straight through the walls of their bondage. The tanks rolled in, and they ushered the slaves out on truck beds in a massive convoy. And now freed, this massive group of prisoners were brought out towards the camp of the wise king and given food and care and medicine. The physicians of the wise king bandaged up the slaves and on their journey back taught them how to live freely in what would be their new home. 3 weeks later they arrived with much rejoicing, and the wise king threw a great feast where he told them how glad he was for their safe return, thanking his spies, thanking his army. And as he discussed with the leaders how to draw these new citizens into his kingdom, he also discussed with the physicians the plans for their healing and freedom from the disease that they carried with them. But then just before the physicians were able to care for these slaves, something happened. The dormant virus injected into them by the evil king began to awaken, and there was no potion now to hold back the disease. Only a deeper plan to free them by rest and rehabilitation. Thinking they were in need of the evil king's potion, the former slaves' bodies began to cringe, and a great cry rose up in the camp. Senseless quarreling broke out in various quarters. People started becoming suspicious and jealous of each other. Some were racing to find wine, and all the forms of self-control started to become unhinged. Chaos arose. And in the case of Israel, Exodus tells us, they rose early. Leaders knew something was amiss because the people had been sleeping in and really resting for the first time in their lives. And they began to offer sacrifice to the idols they shaped out of gold. They ate and they drank and they rose up to revel, which means they needed to hide the women and the children. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you have brought out of Egypt have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I have commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed to it and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation.'" Moses implored the Lord and basically says to God, "Well, how embarrassing, God, that will be for you. Your name will be blemished. You brought all these people out to the wilderness and then killed them. The world will think you a monster." And as Exodus says, the Lord changed his mind. Exodus doesn't say this, but Exodus should have said something like, the Lord changed his mind about dropping the nuke on his people. Okay, there's so much here, especially about the revelry, how broken humans can become unhinged when everything which seems secure to us feels lost, when a deep welling of abandonment overcomes us, and we rush headlong trying just to feel something again. I can't get to that today, so I'd encourage you to study for yourself Exodus 32. But I really think I want to take the last few moments here to dive in to God's character. On the surface of the story, we could be forgiven if we thought, okay, this God's a monster. He writes the death penalty for working on a day of rest. He seems ready to wipe out all of the people in a moment's notice. What about the innocents, God? And in our shallow understanding of God's authority, based on what we would expect from human authorities, we might be forgiven if we understood the phrase, "Let my wrath burn hot against them and consume them," as some sort of cold and heartless, wicked response. We too have been infected in our imaginations by the abuse of lesser kings. God held a profound love and affection for Israel. He did not find them disposable or disgusting, but incredibly essential for the fulfillment of his mission to defeat death, and he needed them fully freed. It takes them some time to figure out this. The prophet Hosea reflects on this many hundreds of years later, reflects on this moment of the Exodus story with some help from God. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and sacrificing incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms. But they did not know that it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. In this moment of apparent divine hopelessness, God didn't have a disgust in a sense that Israel was disposable. He had this deeply consequential two-mindedness. I could lay these people down right now in their pain and in their brokenness. Let them have their peace after 400 years, generations of cruel slavery. Start again, ensure that the people of Moses could be freed from the effects of this slavery. Or I could walk the long road of healing with them and spend the next 50 generations playing out this long story of restoration. Moses, in his humility and petition, must have caused the heart of God a great delight as Moses mediated for the people, as he told God, God, if you're going to do that, take me instead. Let them be, take me. Part of what it is to become a people of God is to know how that we are not disposable, we are not disgusting to God, and to become the type of people who don't want to dispose others that we're disgusted by. That's what it is to join with him in his restoration plan of sin, working against sin and death. And God saw the spark of hope in Moses needed to work with them. He did not find them disposable. He did not find them disappointing. He found them deeply unwell for the mission at hand, which is key to remember here. God's goal is not to give humans a happy life of 80 years to pass on to the next generation. God's goal is to undo death itself. That's what he's after. That's what he's always after. He always is fixed on the same finality: new creation, restoration of all that was lost, gathered up into life everlasting. And he wanted to do it not by snapping his fingers, but by the forging of a people fit for the task, alive, whole, unbitten, able to further the causes of life and not death. Just as they did, we too must come to our deeply held convictions that despite what it looks like, God's not a monster, he's a rescuer through and through. If God were a monster, Christianity and Judaism would not have survived 3,000 years with its billions of followers. If we have found God guilty of monstrous abuse, we have not worked our way through the many pretenders, many idols pretending to be God. We've not worked our way through them to the treasures of our tradition. We are not disposable on the side of God, but terribly vulnerable. And we, like they, must come to learn that God's wrath is never directed against our personhood, but transfixed directly on that which enslaves us. And I'm going to say that again, because that's really what I'm spending the time trying to say today. We must come to learn that God's wrath is never directed against our personhood, but always transfixed on that which enslaves us. That's where God's wrath is directed. The most famous verse of the Bible: God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Not God so hated the world that he had to kill his only son. Okay, it's become a one-point sermon. Sorry guys, I'm going to skip over the worship stuff just this morning. The whole point of the worshiping life of Israel, I'll just say this. The whole point of the worshiping life of Israel was revealed by God on Moses to Sinai. God told Moses, when the people are prompted to show their love to me, let them bring me gifts. Let them make a sanctuary for me. Let them come to me and experience not just a time of giving me praise, but a time where their self-forgetting becomes their healing. I'll find a time to work this in later in the semester, guys. There's so many ways in which we can use this space to find the very healing finger of God in our life that the Israelites knew and came to love. But I'm not sure then what this word for you today, the early Christians, Jesus and Paul and the early church always came back to this moment as a significant moment to understand God and who we are as human beings. On Thursday, we've built a whole service. You'll see on your schedules there's no speaker on Thursday. We've built a whole service up around responding to this text, responding to this word. We're going to have more songs than usual, more of a chance for you to express worship in this space, and we'll have communion. And I'm looking forward to what your incredible worship leaders have prepared for you. I welcome you to join that space with open hearts. So for today, my prayer is that whatever it is God is stirring in your life, that you know that He's teaching you to walk today. He's taking you up in His arms. He is, even if you cannot feel it, working to bind you up and heal your wounds. As we transition today back into our responsibilities, may we receive His sustenance and most of all be lifted up into His kindness and His love for us today. JB, you go in peace.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the John Brown University Chapel Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes or whatever platform you're listening on, and we'd love it if you would leave us a review.